You ever watch an entire neighborhood realize their only way out belongs to the guy they mocked 6 months earlier? The metallic buzz of the intercom echoed across the Texas morning while a line of luxury SUVs idled in front of my steel gate, engines rumbling low in the cold dawn air. Exhaust fumes drifted over the cedar trees. Somebody behind the line leaned on their horn. Then another. Then 5 more joined in like an angry orchestra. Right in the middle of it stood Deborah Whitmore in white tennis shoes and oversized sunglasses, slamming her manicured palm against my locked gate hard enough to rattle the chain. "You can't do this!" she screamed through the bars. "People live back here!" I took another sip of black coffee from my porch and watched sunlight bounce off the fresh black steel posts I'd installed 3 nights earlier. The electric motor hummed softly beside me, smooth and quiet, the kind of expensive commercial-grade system meant for industrial properties, not suburban shortcuts. Funny thing was, none of this would have happened if Deborah had respected one simple word. Property. The smell of dust and diesel hung heavy in the warming air while real estate agents in pastel polos climbed out of their BMWs and Lexus SUVs farther down the road, trying to figure out why the entrance to Willow Creek Estates suddenly looked like a county impound yard. Nobody was getting through. Not today. Not anymore. 6 months earlier, I was sitting in a cramped apartment outside Dallas listening to my divorce attorney explain how much my fresh start was going to cost me. Turns out 15 years of marriage disappears real fast once lawyers start billing by the hour. By the end of that summer, all I wanted was silence. No traffic. No neighbors arguing through drywall. No HOA emails about trash cans or grass height. Just land. Real land. 50 acres outside Austin popped up on a foreclosure listing late one night, while I was drinking cheap bourbon and scrolling property auctions on my laptop. Most buyers ignored it because the listing described the land as isolated with limited access complications. But when I opened the county map, I noticed something everybody else missed. One narrow gravel road cut directly through the edge of the property and connected to the backside of Willow Creek Estates. A private road. My road. I bought the land 3 weeks later. Cash. The first time I drove out there, the gravel crunched under my tires like broken glass. Cedar trees swayed against a burnt orange sunset, and the whole place smelled like dry earth and mesquite. Peaceful. Quiet. Exactly what I needed. At least until Deborah Whitmore showed up in her white Range Rover before I'd even unpacked my toolbox. She stepped out wearing a bright blue workout jacket with a smile sharp enough to strip paint off a truck. "Hi there," she said sweetly, staring past me toward the road. "Just so you know, the community uses this access route daily." Community. Funny word considering the deed in my glove box said otherwise. Back then, I just nodded politely. Biggest mistake I made that year. The first week on that land felt like breathing again after years underwater. Every morning I woke up to wind pushing through cedar branches instead of traffic outside an apartment wall. No sirens. No neighbors slamming car doors at midnight. Just the dry smell of Texas dirt warming under the sun and the distant hum of cicadas rolling across the hills. I spent my days repairing old fence lines, clearing brush, and rebuilding a weathered equipment shed near the tree line. Honest work. Quiet work. The kind that keeps your hands busy enough for your head to finally settle down. My nearest neighbor sat almost half a mile away, but Willow Creek Estates backed right against the southern edge of my property like somebody had dropped a polished suburban island into the middle of ranch country. Perfect green lawns. Decorative stone signs. Matching mailboxes lined up like soldiers. At night I could see the glow from their clubhouse lights flickering through the trees while my sides stayed dark except for the porch bulb over my cabin. At first, the traffic on the gravel road barely registered. A golf cart here. A delivery van there. People waved as they crossed through my property like it was some public county shortcut. I figured maybe the previous owner had allowed it. Years ago. Texas folks do neighborly things sometimes. But within 2 weeks, the road started sounding like a shopping center parking lot every morning. Tires crunching gravel before sunrise. Landscaping trailers rattling past my porch. Contractors flying through at 40 miles an hour kicking red dust across my fencing supplies. One afternoon I came back from town hauling lumber and found 3 teenagers parked beside my cattle pond blasting music from a Jeep Wrangler with the doors off. Empty energy drink cans already scattered near the waterline. They looked at me like I was interrupting them on public property. "This road goes to the neighborhood," one of them said when I asked what they were doing. "Everybody comes back here." Everybody. That word sat in my stomach the rest of the evening while I watched another stream of cars cut across my land toward Willow Creek Estates. The next morning I noticed something new nailed beside the road entrance. A polished wooden sign with decorative lettering that read, "Willow Creek Community Access." My coffee nearly slipped out of my hand. The sign stood on my side of the survey markers. My property. Fresh concrete still wet around the posts. I could smell it curing in the heat. That was the moment I understood Deborah Whitmore was not dealing with confusion. She was creating ownership by repetition. If enough people treated the road like community property long enough, eventually nobody would question it. Especially not the homeowners paying $600,000 for houses advertised with private countryside access. Deborah showed up later that afternoon driving her white Range Rover slow enough to let the tires throw dust against my boots. She stepped out smiling like we were old friends. "The residents are just so grateful to have this convenient route," she said while adjusting oversized sunglasses. "It really increases property values for everybody." I looked at the sign behind her. "You put that on my land without asking." Her smile tightened for half a second. "Barely noticeable unless you were looking for it." "Oh, Ethan, the previous owner never minded. We have always treated this as shared access." Shared. Another carefully chosen word. Then she handed me an envelope like she was delivering a Christmas card. Inside was an invoice from the HOA for road maintenance improvements totaling $4,300. I actually laughed standing there in the heat with cedar pollen floating through the air. Deborah did not laugh back. Things escalated after I ignored the invoice. Deborah was the kind of person who treated silence like a challenge. 2 days later I woke up to the grinding sound of machinery outside my cabin just after sunrise. The deep hydraulic whine echoed through the cedar trees while the smell of fresh diesel drifted through my open kitchen window. I stepped outside holding a coffee mug and found an entire landscaping crew parked beside the gravel road on my property. 3 trucks. A skid steer. Workers unloading decorative stone and wooden flower planters like they were preparing a resort entrance. One guy was already digging holes beside my fence line. "Morning," the foreman called casually without stopping. "We are installing community beautification improvements." Community. There was that word again. I looked past him and saw Deborah standing beside her Range Rover wearing a white visor and holding a clipboard against her chest like some suburban field marshal inspecting troops. She smiled the second our eyes met. "We are improving the entrance experience," she said. "Homeowners voted unanimously." I remember the exact sound my boots made crunching across the gravel toward her. Slow. Sharp. Controlled. "This is private property." Her smile never moved. "Actually, Ethan, after years of uninterrupted public usage, things become more complicated than that." That sentence stayed with me all day. Not because she was right, but because she thought she was. Deborah had spent so many years acting like authority that she genuinely believed confidence could replace ownership. By noon they had installed 2 giant decorative stone planters directly beside my road entrance along with small black lantern lights wired into a timer system. I stood there staring at professionally landscaped trespassing while hot wind carried the smell of cut cedar and fresh mulch through the air. Then came the emails. Apparently Deborah had circulated a community newsletter introducing Willow Creek Scenic Access Route as an official neighborhood feature. Somebody even uploaded photos to the HOA website showing families jogging down my gravel road at sunset. My phone started buzzing with messages from real estate agents asking whether I planned to pave the community road extension anytime soon. That was when I realized the real game. Deborah was building perception first. Paperwork later. If enough people believed the road belonged to Willow Creek Estates, eventually the truth would feel inconvenient. A week later I came home from town hauling fencing supplies and nearly slammed my truck into a golf cart parked sideways across the entrance. Deborah sat inside it sipping iced coffee while two women in workout clothes stood beside her staring at my property like tourists. "Ladies," she announced proudly when I stepped out of the truck. "This is the acreage I told you about." Told them about. Like I was scenery. One of the women smiled awkwardly. "Deborah says the HOA may add walking trails back here someday." The air inside my chest turned cold despite the heat. I looked at Deborah. "You are showing people development plans on my land now?" She tilted her head slowly, completely unbothered. "Well, if you ever decide to sell, this community would certainly benefit from proper integration." Integration. Another carefully polished word hiding something ugly underneath. I noticed then that somebody had spray painted a small white arrow onto one of my fence posts pointing toward the neighborhood. Tiny detail. Probably meaningless to everybody else. But standing there under that burning Texas sun with gravel dust sticking to my jeans, it felt like watching strangers slowly move furniture into your house while pretending they already lived there. Deborah thought she was being subtle. She thought pressure and repetition would wear me down eventually. What she did not understand was that I had spent 15 years working commercial construction contracts across Texas. I knew exactly how land disputes started. More importantly, I knew how they ended. 3 days after the landscaping stunt, I found a bright yellow notice stapled to my gatepost flapping in the hot wind like a warning flag. The paper smelled fresh off the printer. Official HOA violation notice. Unauthorized storage of construction materials. Failure to maintain roadway aesthetics. Obstruction of community visibility. I stood there reading it while sweat rolled down my neck under the afternoon sun, listening to another convoy of golf carts rattle past like they owned the place. Deborah had officially crossed into fantasy territory now. She was issuing violations on land outside the HOA boundary. My land. I drove straight to the county records office the next morning hoping somebody there would shut this nonsense down quickly. The building smelled like old paper, floor polish, and stale coffee. Ceiling fans clicked overhead while a clerk named Wanda pulled up the subdivision maps on a faded computer screen. "Well," she muttered slowly, adjusting her glasses. "Your acreage definitely sits outside Willow Creek Estate's jurisdiction." For the first time in weeks I felt my shoulders loosen a little. Then she zoomed farther into the property lines and frowned. "But this access road situation is messy." Messy. Another dangerous word. Turns out Deborah had spent years filing neighborhood improvement references with the county describing the road as historically shared community access. Nothing official enough to transfer ownership, but enough paperwork to create confusion. That was her specialty. She did not need to win legally if she could exhaust people emotionally first. Wanda handed me copies of the old plats while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. "Honestly," she said quietly, "you may need a survey attorney if this escalates." Escalates. Too late for that. By the time I got back to the property, 2 orange traffic cones sat beside my entrance along with another news sign. "Slow children at play." Somebody had installed it directly beside my fence while I was gone. I stared at it for a solid 10 seconds in complete disbelief. The smell of hot plastic from the sign baking under the Texas sun mixed with cedar dust in the air. Then I heard tires behind me. Deborah again. Always Deborah. Her Range Rover rolled up slowly, windows down, sunglasses on. "Just trying to keep families safe," she called out sweetly. I held up the violation notice. "You know your HOA has no authority here, right?" Her expression never changed. That calm smile. That poison-coated confidence. "Authority comes from consistency, Ethan. Communities evolve." I remember laughing once. Short. Sharp. Mostly because I could not believe a real human being actually spoke like that outside of political dramas. Then she dropped the sentence that changed everything. "Besides," she added casually, You cannot realistically block access now anyway. Too many people depend on this road. Depend on it. The second she drove away, I walked back toward my equipment shed with that sentence echoing in my head louder than the cicadas screaming through the trees. Too many people depend on this road. Not want. Depend. That night I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by county plats and survey copies while a thunderstorm rolled across the hills outside. Rain hammered the tin roof hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. I traced property lines under the yellow glow of an old lamp and started noticing something strange. Willow Creek Estates had expanded in phases over 15 years. Every newer section curved farther toward my acreage. Farther toward the road. Then I found a drainage utility map folded into one of the county packets. My stomach tightened instantly. The entire unfinished expansion phase on the south end of the subdivision only had one legal emergency access route listed. Mine. Suddenly Deborah's obsession made perfect sense. This was never about convenience. It was survival. If access disappeared, future permits, construction approvals, and possibly millions in property development stalled with it. Outside, thunder cracked across the hills while rainwater rolled down the gravel road they thought belonged to them. I leaned back in my chair staring at the maps spread across the table and finally understood exactly why Deborah had been smiling all this time. She thought I did not know how much power sat behind that gate. The rain from the night before left the gravel road damp and darker than usual, stretching like a shadow through my property toward Willow Creek Estates. I stood at the edge of my porch that morning watching the mist lift slowly off the cedar trees while the first vehicles of the day started rolling in again like nothing had changed. It always started the same way now. One car. Then two. Then a steady flow of traffic cutting through land they had convinced themselves belonged to everyone. I could hear Deborah before I saw her. The crunch of tires stopping too close to my gate, followed by the soft click of a car door, and that familiar rhythm of confident footsteps on gravel. She did not even bother greeting me this time. Instead, she walked directly up to the gate and tapped on it lightly with her knuckles like she was knocking on a neighbor's front door. "Ethan," she said calmly, "we need to resolve this access issue before it becomes disruptive for the community." I remember leaning against the wooden post of my porch, still holding a half-finished cup of coffee, watching her like she was speaking about a road I had never seen before. "There is no access issue," I said. My voice was steady. Almost too steady. "This is private property." She sighed like I was being difficult on purpose and opened a folder she had clearly prepared in advance. Inside were printed maps, highlighted routes, and photographs of vehicles using my land as a shortcut. Some of them were even time-stamped. "Usage creates precedent," she said, pointing at the papers. "The county recognizes long-term functional access patterns." I felt the heat rise slightly in my chest but kept my voice level. "Usage does not create ownership." That was the first time I saw something shift behind her eyes. Not anger. Calculation. She closed the folder slowly and nodded like she was listening to a stubborn contractor refusing a reasonable request. "Then I suppose we will have to formalize it," she said. That evening I noticed survey flags appearing along the edge of my property. Bright orange markers pushed into the soil like someone was mapping out lines that did not exist the day before. I drove out there on my ATV and followed them until they led me directly to the road intersection where Willow Creek Estates began. A small crew was already there installing metal posts for what looked like future signage. One of them waved casually at me like I was a passing neighbor. "HOA Improvement Project," he said without hesitation. "We are just marking the community boundary extension." Boundary extension. The phrase hit me harder than I expected. Because there was no extension approved anywhere in county records. I checked that myself twice. Still, there they were, building perception one post at a time. I drove back slowly, tires rolling over wet gravel, listening to the steady crunch beneath me while thinking about how quietly something false could start to feel normal if enough people repeated it. By the time I reached my cabin, Deborah was already waiting near my mailbox. Not inside my land this time, just right at the edge, like she was respecting invisible rules only she believed in. She smiled when she saw me. "Ethan," she said, "you are a reasonable man. This does not have to become complicated." I shut off my engine and sat there for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Around us the land was silent except for wind moving through dry grass. "It is already complicated," I said finally. Her smile did not fade, but something about it felt thinner now. Like paper stretched too far. "Then let us simplify it," she replied. She handed me another envelope before turning back toward her vehicle. This one had a county stamp on it. Inside was a formal notice referencing Proposed Access Integration Review, scheduled for the following week. I watched her drive away down my road while dust lifted behind her tires and realized this was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about momentum. And she was trying to make the entire system move in her direction before anyone noticed it was never supposed to move at all. The morning after I received the county notice, I drove out before sunrise and parked halfway down my gravel road just to watch the light come up over Willow Creek Estates. The air was still cool enough to carry the smell of damp earth, but I could already hear movement on the other side of the trees. Trucks idling. Doors slamming. The familiar rhythm of a neighborhood waking up. Except now it felt different. Heavier. Like something had been set in motion that nobody had fully understood yet. I stayed in my truck as a white SUV crossed onto my property without slowing down, tires rolling over the same gravel I had spent weeks maintaining. No hesitation. No acknowledgement. Just forward movement, like the land was a suggestion rather than a boundary. That was when I understood Deborah had shifted tactics. She was no longer asking. She was documenting reality in a way that suited her outcome. By mid-morning, I saw surveyors again. Different team this time. Official-looking vehicles with county markings parked near the roadside while they placed new markers farther into my acreage. I stepped out of my truck and walked straight toward them, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. One of them looked up briefly but did not stop working. "Morning," I said. The lead surveyor adjusted his tripod and pointed toward a laminated map clipped to his folder. "We are verifying the proposed access alignment for future infrastructure planning," he said without looking at me. "Future infrastructure," I repeated. He nodded like it was already decided. That word again. Future. As if repetition could turn intention into authority. I took the map from his hand long enough to look at it closely. The line they had drawn did not follow any recorded easement. It curved through the edge of my property like a polite invasion. "This is not approved," I said quietly. The surveyor finally met my eyes, but his expression stayed neutral. "We are working off county direction," he replied. That was the moment I realized Deborah had done something far more dangerous than trespassing. She had started embedding assumptions into official workflow. I drove straight to the county office again that afternoon. The same fluorescent lights. The same stale coffee smell. But this time the atmosphere felt colder. Wanda was not at her desk, and the clerk who replaced her barely looked up when I placed my folder on the counter. "I need clarification on a submitted access integration review," I said. He typed slowly, clicked through several screens, then leaned back slightly. "Oh yeah," he said. "That came through from Willow Creek Estates Planning Liaison." "Liaison," I repeated. He nodded. "They are coordinating with a private survey group. Looks standard for expansion adjustments." I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, something more precise. Recognition. Deborah had not forged documents. She had built parallel versions of reality and fed them into the system just enough that no single office questioned the whole picture at once. When I returned to my land, I found small wooden stakes now stretching deeper into my property line than before. Each one marked with colored tape fluttering in the wind like silent flags claiming space. I walked along them slowly, counting each marker, listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots and the distant hum of Willow Creek Estates beyond the trees. That night I sat on my porch longer than usual. The sky turned deep blue, then black, and the first porch light from the subdivision flickered on like a signal. I opened my laptop and pulled up every county document I had collected since the beginning. Deeds, surveys, utility maps, emails, notices. Everything. And then I saw it. A single inconsistency buried in the newest planning file. A reference to Emergency Access Dependency Corridor. Not labeled as permanent. Not labeled as private. But referenced in a way that suggested operational necessity. My eyes stayed on that line for a long time. Because if something becomes operationally necessary, people stop asking whether it belongs to someone. They start asking how to justify it. The morning started with silence so thick it felt intentional. No trucks. No survey crews. No golf carts cutting through my land. Just wind moving through cedar branches and the distant sound of tires on pavement far beyond the trees. I should have known that kind of silence never lasts when someone like Deborah Whitmore is involved. Around mid-morning, I noticed movement at the far edge of my property near the old drainage line. A black pickup truck sat idling with hazard lights blinking. Slowly, and beside it stood two men in reflective vests marking the ground with bright flags. I did not walk out immediately. I watched first. Learned that patience often reveals more than confrontation ever does. They were not placing random markers anymore. They were following a continuous line, one that extended from the county road, across the edge of Willow Creek Estates, and directly onto my land with precision that looked official. When I finally stepped out of my truck and approached, one of them checked a tablet and said without hesitation that they were confirming final alignment for emergency access designation. Emergency access. That phrase again. It was no longer just paperwork. It was becoming language repeated often enough to feel real. I asked who authorized it. The man tapped his screen and replied that it was part of coordinated infrastructure planning between the county and subdivision representatives. Subdivision representatives. Not named. Not defined. Just an open door for interpretation. I did not argue. I walked the line instead. Each flag planted in the soil felt heavier than the last, not physically, but in meaning. Someone was drawing permanence into my land one step at a time. By the time I reached the creek crossing, I saw something new that had not been there the day before. A temporary bridge structure had been staged nearby, steel beams laid out on wooden supports like a puzzle waiting to be assembled. I stood there long enough for the workers to notice me, but none of them spoke. They simply continued measuring distances as if my presence was irrelevant to the outcome. That evening I drove into town again, this time to speak directly with the county engineer's office. The building was quieter than usual, almost empty, and the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as I waited. When the engineer finally came out, he looked tired in the way people do when they are managing problems created by others. I placed my folder on his desk and opened it to the survey maps, pointing directly at the new alignment line cutting through my property. "This does not match any recorded easement," I said. He studied it for a long time without speaking, then leaned back slightly in his chair. "It is being reviewed under Emergency Operational Dependency Classification," he said carefully. I repeated the words slowly in my head. Emergency Operational Dependency Classification. That was not ownership. That was justification language. A way to treat private land as temporary infrastructure without formally changing its status. "Who initiated it?" I asked. He hesitated just long enough for me to understand the answer was complicated. "Coordination came through Willow Creek Estates Development Management," he finally said. That name again without a signature. Without accountability. When I returned home, I drove slowly along my gravel road and noticed fresh tire tracks where none should have been. Not deep enough to suggest heavy equipment. Light, repetitive traffic patterns. Someone had been testing access repeatedly throughout the day. I parked near my cabin and sat in the quiet for a long time, watching the last light of sunset fade behind the trees while the subdivision lights flickered on in the distance like a separate world slowly asserting itself over mine. Deborah had stopped trying to convince me. She had started building systems around me that functioned whether I agreed or not. And the most dangerous part was how normal it was beginning to look from a distance. The morning of the final escalation started with an unusual kind of stillness that did not feel natural to my land anymore. No early trucks, no survey flags moving in the wind, no distant hum of construction. Even the birds sounded quieter, as if the entire valley was waiting for something to happen. I was standing near my porch when I noticed the first vehicle turn onto my gravel road. Then another. Then a steady line forming behind it. Not random traffic this time. Organized. Coordinated. A procession of cars and utility trucks moving with purpose directly toward Willow Creek Estates. I did not need anyone to tell me what was happening. The county had scheduled the Access Integration Review meeting on site. And somehow, that meant my land had become the center of it. I walked down toward the gate slowly, boots pressing into the gravel, with a rhythm that felt heavier than usual. As I approached, I saw temporary signage already installed near the entrance, directing vehicles toward approved corridor staging. The words were printed on clean laminated boards like everything here had already been decided in advance. Across the gate, Deborah Whitmore stood in a tailored jacket with a clipboard in hand, speaking to county officials and survey teams like she was hosting an event rather than standing on disputed property. She turned the moment she saw me and smiled with that same controlled confidence I had seen from the beginning. "Perfect timing," she said calmly. "We are just about to begin final alignment confirmation." I stopped a few feet from the gate. Behind her, I could see at least a dozen vehicles waiting in formation, including county trucks, private contractor vans, and real estate representatives holding folders marked with subdivision branding. The entire system was present. Not just Deborah anymore. Something larger had formed around her decisions. An official atmosphere built on repetition and paperwork. A county engineer stepped forward and began explaining that the access corridor designation required on-site verification before final approval. He spoke like everything was procedural, like my presence was simply part of the checklist. I placed my folder on the hood of my truck and opened it slowly. Inside were deed records, survey maps, and printed correspondence from the county office. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt. I simply pointed to the boundary line drawn across the maps. "This corridor crosses private land without recorded easement," I said clearly. The engineer glanced at the documents but did not respond immediately. Instead, Deborah stepped in slightly, her tone calm but firm. "The community has relied on this access for years," she said. "We are simply formalizing what already exists." That word again. Formalizing. As if repetition could substitute for legal foundation. I could feel the weight of every vehicle behind her, every official presence waiting for the process to validate what had already been assumed. This was no longer about a road. It was about whether assumption could outrun documentation. The engineer finally spoke again, explaining that emergency dependency classification allowed temporary operational usage pending resolution. Temporary. Operational. Dependency. Carefully chosen words stacked together to create flexibility where there was supposed to be none. I closed my folder. Around us, the wind moved through the trees, carrying dust from the gravel road into the edges of the staging area. I looked at Deborah directly. For the first time, her expression was not fully certain. Not fear. Not doubt. Just a brief pause in the confidence she had been building for months. "You are trying to turn temporary access into permanent reality," I said quietly. She did not answer immediately. The silence stretched between us while engines idled behind her and papers shifted in the hands of county staff. Then she said something that revealed everything underneath the strategy. "If it functions like infrastructure," she replied, "it becomes infrastructure." That was when I understood the entire structure she had built. Not ownership. Not legality. Perception layered over time until enforcement becomes reaction instead of prevention. I turned back toward my truck and placed my hand on the door handle, listening to the steady hum of engines waiting for approval that was never guaranteed to come. The land behind me was still mine. But for the first time, I could see how easily systems could start behaving as if it was not. The final morning did not feel like a victory at first. It felt like waiting. The same stretch of gravel road that had carried weeks of tension now sat quiet under a pale Texas sky, lined with vehicles that no longer moved with confidence but with hesitation. County trucks, survey units, and representatives from Willow Creek Estates stood positioned in a loose formation near my gate, but something had changed in the atmosphere. There was no coordination in their posture anymore, only uncertainty. I stepped out of my truck carrying the same folder I had carried for weeks, its edges worn from being opened and closed too many times. Deborah Whitmore stood near the front of the group, but she was no longer speaking. For the first time since this began, she was waiting like everyone else. The county engineer called the meeting to order on site, his voice steady but different from before, as if the weight of what he was about to say had finally caught up to him. He reviewed the documents one final time, comparing recorded easements, property boundaries, and the emergency operational dependency classification that had been referenced repeatedly in prior weeks. Then he stopped. The silence that followed was sharp enough to feel physical. He looked up and said clearly that no legal easement existed across my property, and that emergency classification could not override recorded land ownership or create permanent access rights. The words did not come with emotion. They came with finality. Around him, papers shifted, pens stopped moving, and for a moment even the wind seemed to slow. Deborah stepped forward as if to respond, but nothing came out immediately. The system she had built was not designed for refusal at this level. It depended on delay, ambiguity, and procedural layering. But now there was no ambiguity left. Only record and reality. I placed my folder on the hood of my truck and did not speak at first. The engineer confirmed again that all prior assumptions regarding access were invalid without formal acquisition or negotiated agreement. He then stated that continued use of the roadway without authorization would require immediate cessation pending legal resolution. That was the moment the entire structure shifted. Not dramatically, quietly, but permanently. Vehicles that had been waiting for movement began to reposition themselves. County staff lowered clipboards. Real estate representatives stopped checking phones. The idea that this road functioned as a shared corridor dissolved in real time under the weight of documented ownership. Deborah finally spoke, but her voice was no longer anchored in certainty. It carried something closer to disbelief. She tried to reference community dependency, historical usage, and prior coordination, but each point fell into silence as the engineer reiterated that none of it altered recorded property rights. I remember looking past her toward the road itself. The same gravel, the same cedar trees, the same boundary markers I had seen every day since I arrived. Nothing about the land had changed. Only the assumption around it had. When the meeting ended, there was no celebration. No confrontation. Just movement. Slowly, vehicles turned around one by one, rerouting back through the subdivision and away from my gate. Deborah remained standing for a few seconds longer than the rest, watching the space where her system had existed only moments before. Then she walked back to her vehicle without another word. In the weeks that followed, official notices replaced assumptions. The access designation was formally withdrawn. Alternative routing was required for all future development activity. And for the first time since I bought the land, the gravel road returned to what it had always been under the law, even when people tried to ignore it. Private. Standing alone on my porch that evening, I watched the sun drop behind the cedar line while the last traces of outside traffic disappeared beyond my property edge. The gate was still there, unchanged, but it no longer represented a barrier being tested. It represented something simpler. A line that had always been real, finally acknowledged by everyone who had crossed it.